So back in 2010, I was in need of a tube amp. I had grown up playing solid state practice amps and I needed something to get out and start gigging with, to start working with. And so I started shopping. And I remember the feeling of just being completely overwhelmed by all of the options and different amps and sizes and wattages and circuits and brands and features and just not knowing what was right for me. So today I'm going to make the video that I wish I could have watched back in 2010 about tube amps. How to find the right tube amp, whether it's your first one or your 20th one. There's a few things that you should be looking out for to help you decide on which amp is right for you and your needs. Now the amp that we're going to be using today is the brand new DGT-15 from PRS, and PRS is actually sponsoring today's video, so thank you to them for that. The DGT-15 is an all-new 15-watt vintage voice amplifier that David Grissom developed with the amplifier team over at PRS. And it's a great candidate for today's video because it's super versatile, covers a lot of ground from really nice, sparkling, clean tones to medium gain, edge of breakup stuff, all the way to classic sort of searing lead tones and kind of everything in between. Now, everything we talk about in today's video is not unique to this amp. The concepts and ideas you can apply to any amplifier that you own or that you're looking for, but we're going to feature the DGT-15. So once again, thank you to PRS for sponsoring today's video. If you want more information about this new amp, I'll have some links in the description box down below. Some of those will be affiliate links, which means I earn a small commission if you purchase something through that. Doesn't cost you any extra, and it really helps me keep the channel going over here, and I greatly appreciate it. Also, please subscribe. Still, according to the analytics, over 60% of the people that watch this channel on a normal basis are not subscribed. It really does help me out when you click that little red button. So with all that out of the way, let's hear this new amp. So here's how this video is going to work. If you look below, there are chapter markers denoting the different sections where we're talking about stuff, because I'm going to be talking about things that are geared towards complete beginners, people that have never owned a tube amp, as well as people that have owned amps for years and might be looking for their next thing. So with that in mind, we're going to start with the very basics of tube amplifiers and their layout and kind of what to look for. So the DGT-15 here is what's known as a head and cabinet configuration, where the amplifier itself sits in this box and it's sitting on top of the speaker cabinet below it. So no sound actually comes out of this head up here. A couple of quick notes about tube amplifiers if you're coming from a solid state amp. First of all, with any tube amplifier, but specifically like a head and cabinet situation, you should never ever turn the amp on and run it without the speaker cable plugged into the speaker or giving it some kind of load. You can damage the transformers and the circuit and the amplifier if you run it without any kind of load. So always have a speaker cable installed. On that note, use a speaker cable, not a guitar cable. I've seen this before where people just plug an instrument cable in. They're not the same thing. They're a different design and it will damage your amplifier. Now, some amps you'll see have a power switch and a standby switch. The DGT-15 only has a power switch, and that's because guitar amplifiers don't actually need standby switches. That's kind of a myth. They're not a mute for when you're taking breaks on a gig. And in fact, you actually shouldn't be turning the amp on and off standby once it's warmed up. Now, there's some nerdy technical reasons for this, but this is, old vacuum tube technology. And as such, these circuits in particular do not need standby switches, which is why the DGT-15 actually doesn't have one. Now, on the layout side of things, like I said, we have the head and cabinet configuration here, but there's also another setup called a combo amplifier, where the amplifier itself and the speaker cabinet are all in one box. Combos can be a little bit more convenient if you're loading in and out of gigs and rehearsals quite a bit, but I always prefer head and cabinets over combos for a few reasons. One, I play at home a lot. I do a lot of recording, and I like the ability to have my amplifier head in the same room that I'm recording with the speaker cabinet isolated and mic'd up in a completely other room. Or if you're playing primarily at home and you don't even necessarily want a speaker cabinet, you can get some kind of direct load box like an aux or a Torpedo Captor X. The other main advantage with head and cabinet setups is you can mix and match. I can get get a different speaker cabinet, which is going to sound different, both because of the speakers that are loaded in it, but because of the construction of the cabinet, which is not as easily done with combo amplifiers. So back when I was looking for my first guitar amp, one of the things that really confused me was the power, the output power of the amplifier, which is noted in watts. Like I said, this is a 15 watt amp. I thought, because I was going to be gigging, that I needed as big and powerful as an amp as possible. And so as a result, I was shopping for and looking at 100 watt amps, like a dual rectifier, for example, which looking back now is hilarious because I don't play that style of music. I don't need a super high gain, massive tube amp like that. But at the time, that's what I thought I needed. The reality is, I think most guitar players out there, whether you're playing in your bedroom or you're doing weekend warrior type gigs or you're touring on the road full time, can get away with amps that are in the 15 watt to 30 watt category, maybe 40 watts. That's kind of the sweet spot, the Goldilocks zone, in my opinion, when it comes to output power. This 15 watt amp is plenty loud. Don't let the number fool you. It's not quiet. It's loud enough to get over just about any drummer that I would ever play with. It's loud enough to fill up just about any stage, and especially since we're going to be miking the amp up when we're recording and playing live shows, I don't need it to fill an entire venue, which is why 100 watt amps were originally created 60 plus years ago. Now, I own a few 100 watt amps now, and I play them, I gig with them. There definitely is a place for those big monster amps, but I think for most players out there, the overwhelming majority who are looking at tube amps, something in this 15 to 30 watt range is right in the sweet spot. So next up is the idea of gain staging, and this is something that confused me for a really long time, so I'm going to try and simplify it here. Gain staging is basically the way of balancing the amount of volume and gain at the different stages of the guitar amp to fit whatever room or sound that you're going for at the time. So this amp, the DGT-15, has two volume controls on it. Over here, we have the preamp volume. This is basically controlling the amount of gain, the overall level of the guitar signal going through the preamp. So you can think of this control on this amp as kind of like an overdrive control. When it's turned down lower, we're going to have cleaner sounds overall, and as we turn it up, it's going to get dirtier and more distorted. Then we also have a master volume on this amp. And like the name suggests, this is the overall output volume of the amplifier. Now, in a perfect world, you'd be able to dial in the amount of gain or saturation or distortion that you wanted from the amp, and then just turn the master volume down to taste, and your tone would remain completely intact. And this amp does have a really good master volume, but that's just not the reality. As you turn your master volume up or down, the overall sound of the amplifier changes with it. The amount of distortion changes, the EQ curve sometimes can often change. So we need to know how to balance the two controls to fit the room and also get the sound that we want. So I'm going to start by just turning the master all the way up. And in fact, on this amp, I have a master volume bypass. So with this switch down, the master volume is completely out of the circuit, and we just have the preamp volume control here. So with it turned down, I have a nice sort of clean sound. But as I turn this up, it's going to get louder, but it's also going to start to distort more. The preamp tubes are going to start breaking up because I'm asking them to work harder than they were designed to work. So we're going to start clipping the signal. I have a whole bunch of videos on this, and I actually have a whole video course dedicated to this called the Tone Course. So you can find it linked down below if you want to go deeper with all this stuff. But this is what happens as we turn the volume control up. And then if I push it to the limit here, almost all the way up, the amp's going to be really overdriven and start to break up. Also notice the noise floor goes up considerably. This is normal with tube amps. This is what they do. Now, that sounds great, but I can tell even sitting here in the room, that's going to be too loud for most of the gigs that I play, most of the rooms that I play. So we're going to engage the master volume. Now listen to what happens as I turn the master volume down by half. The overall amplitude or the volume of the amp goes down, but also the gain changes as well. you'll notice my preamp volume didn't change at all, but the amp's way cleaner and way quieter. That's because I'm turning the output section down. So I'm not getting the distortion from the preamp section and the power amp section. There's basically two sets of tubes in this amplifier, the preamp tubes and the power amp tubes. When the master volume's all the way up and I'm pushing the preamp volume like this, I'm getting distortion from the preamp section and the power amp section together. And that gives us that really sort of meaty, heavy, punchy, great sound that we like from pushed tube amps. But like I said, it's not practical. So this is where the idea of gain staging comes in. How do I get the sound that I want at the volume that's acceptable for whatever room I'm in? So with this situation, I'm gonna kind of dial it in to taste here. I'm gonna push the preamp a little bit more, bring my master volume down, see where we're at. Now I think that's a pretty good sort of bass tone, sort of an edge of breakup tone. But if I wanted more saturation or more distortion out of the amp, I have a few options. I can hit it with a pedal on my pedal board, like a boost or an overdrive. Or some amps like this one actually have their own built-in boost. You can think of it as like its own boost pedal just built into the amplifier. So I can flip that on here, and I'm using the boost in the amplifier. And from there, I can actually turn it down a little more. So understanding how these two volume controls work together in your amplifier, the preamp volume and the master volume if your amp has one, and understanding the idea of gain staging and either using pedals in the front end or a built-in boost if your amp has it, is one of those things that is really important when it comes to actually getting the sounds that you want at the levels you want from your tube amplifier. Now there's a couple of things that affect the overall gain or gain staging in your amplifier. One of the biggest ones is the actual guitar that you're playing, the type of pickups that you're using, and their relative output. So I'm going to switch from my Novo here, and I'm going to go to my Tele. Now traditionally, single coil guitars like this are a little bit lower output than a humbucker guitar, for example. So let's say I was playing this guitar, on a gig or session, I would set my gain staging up with this sound in mind. So again, we're going to push the preamp volume a little bit, leave the master kind of high, and this is what I've got. That sounds great, but listen to what happens when I switch to a guitar with slightly hotter pickups like a Les Paul. Now, a few things are going to change here. First of all, the overall amount of gain coming out of the amplifier is going to change because these are hotter, higher output pickups than what I was just playing on the Telecaster. So I'm going to need to adjust the amp accordingly. The other thing is the EQ, or the sound of the amp, the tone of the amp is going to change as well because these are more mid-rangey, punchy pickups. So to get back closer to where I was, I'm going to bring the preamp volume down a little bit, which is going to bring the gain down, but it's also going to bring the overall level of the amplifier down. So to compensate for that, I'm going to push the master back up a little bit as well. Now, that sounds great, but you can tell the tone of the amplifier changed. This is darker. It's more mid-rangey, it's more bassy than what I was getting out of the Telecaster. And this is going to take us into our next point, which is understanding and dialing in EQ, or the voice of the amp. So the DGT-15 is a good example here because I kind of have the two main food groups of tone controls on most tube amplifiers. I've got a 3-band EQ, I've got treble, middle, and bass controls. But then over here, I also have a top cut and a presence control. So let's start with just the treble, middle, and bass. First thing I might try and do is actually just dial in a little more treble and see where that gets me. Brighter, a little harsher, but it's lacking some mid-range. So if I push the mids, let's see what that does. So hopefully you see what I'm doing here. I'm not afraid to push these controls to their absolute extreme. Let's say the sound I wanted was actually like this. If I rolled the treble back, pushed the mids all the way up, and brought the bass back, what does that sound like? This is one of the things that I wish I had learned and knew sooner, which was don't be afraid of using the tone controls. They're there for a reason, and use all of the available sweep. I think a lot of times guitar players, myself included when I was younger, would really only want to sit in a very limited range of the tone control because I thought, well, if it goes past that, it's just going to sound bad. I mean, it might, but it also might be the sound that you're looking for. So don't be afraid to absolutely dime or cut all of these controls depending on your taste. So use your ears, not your eyes. Don't be worried about where the knobs are set and if you think it looks right. Don't be afraid to use the entire sweep of the tone control and dial it in to taste. Use your ears. If it sounds good, it is good, and it doesn't matter how the amp is set. So now, with that in mind, let's go over to the top cut and the presence control. This is something that you may or may not see on most amplifiers, but it's a really nice feature to have. So the top cut, essentially what it's doing is it's taking the highest frequencies, and as I turn this knob up, basically it's shifting the phase of the high end, and it's causing the highest frequencies to cancel out. I know it's kind of technical and nerdy. Here's what that sounds like. This is one of those things to use to your advantage. If you've got a sound that's really bright and brittle and harsh, and you're changing from a sort of darker guitar to a brighter guitar, a control like this is really useful because you can leave all of this stuff intact and just tame high end with something like a top cut control. The presence control is sort of the opposite. You can think of presence as like a high end boost. It's going to boost those upper frequencies, usually higher than what the treble control is going to give you. So if I just kind of leave these knobs somewhat in the middle, listen to what the presence is doing from 0 all the way up. It's that brilliant, sparkly kind of high end. So to me, sort of the main takeaway of this is to not use your eyes when you're dialing in your amp. Don't go just based off of what your front panel says. Use your ears. Really listen to what the amp is doing and focus on what you're hearing or what you're not hearing and how you want that to change. Use the front panel. Don't be afraid to turn these controls all the way up or down to get the sound that you want. Last point I want to make here is understanding that there is no perfect amplifier. That was one thing that I had wrong, and it kind of took me a while to figure out. Was I thought that I was going to be able to find the perfect amp the first time through, and it was going to be the one amp that I had for the rest of my days and allowed me to do everything that I needed. And my first amp was great, I still have it, but it wasn't that. When I got my hands on that first amp, I learned quickly what it was good at and what it wasn't good at. And I learned sort of what I wanted from an amp that wasn't giving to me. So I moved on to my next amp and had the same sort of experience. This does this thing really, really well, and it's filling this role for me, but I wish it would do this thing a little better. So I found an amp that did that thing. And before you know it, that's how you end up with, a studio full of gear like this. So don't let it go too unchecked. But understanding that there's just no one amp to rule them all. Each one has its own character, its own voice, it has its own strengths and its weaknesses. And when you're picking one, you should sort of take those into account, but don't let it hold you up. Accepting the limitation of whatever amp or rig that you're building for yourself is kind of part of the deal. So hopefully you found this video helpful or interesting. If you did, please let me know by leaving a comment and a like down below. Also, don't forget to subscribe while you're down there. It really does help the channel out. Thanks again to PRS for sponsoring today's video. I will have links to the DGT-15 as well as some of their other amplifiers in the description box down below. So go check it out if you're interested. Honestly, it is a great amp. Like, sponsorship aside, I've been playing it for the last few days down here and it sounds really good. So props to the team and David Grissom for putting out such a cool amplifier. If you want to find my video courses or my free Fretboard Fundamentals ebook, that's all linked in the description box down below. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. My name is Rhett Shull, and I'll catch you on the next one.